Hi everyone! In today's lesson we will cover conflicting viewpoint passages on the ACT. This lesson is part 2 of 3 in our series on the ACT science test passages.
Pay close attention to how this passage type differs from data interpretation passages. Important questions to ask yourself are: which portions of the passage are most important? How do the views of each scientist compare? What evidence is provided by each scientist to further his or her claims? This can be one of the trickier sections on the ACT. So if you feel like you still need help after our video, consider upgrading to testive coaching. All right, let's dive in.
Like usual, the first thing we'll do is show you an example of a typical conflicting viewpoint passage on the ACT science test. One of the first things you want to do when you approach these passages is to take a close look at the introduction to figure out what they're going to be talking about and what both of these passages are going to be responding to. In this case, the more important part after we define what afforestation is that the two scientists will discuss the effects of afforestation on the environments that the new forests are planted into. Just in case you haven't seen this passage before, it is defined up here. Afforestation is a process in which new forests are planted and grown on barren or unforested land. Now, this question is asking about what scientist 2 said, so we want to look at scientist 2's response about the effects of afforestation on the environments the new forests are planted into. It will usually be the first sentence of the response that each scientist has that will tell you what their main idea is. We call this the thesis statement, and it's very, very prominent in conflicting viewpoint passages because this one sentence here tells you the answer very clearly. So scientist 2 says afforestation has many negative impacts on the environments they are planted in. So the thesis here is they don't like what afforestation does to the environments where it occurs. Also, what's they? Again, this is in response to the effects of afforestation in the environments the new forests are planted into, clearly talking about the new forests. Something that also you want to get used to, even though they're not asking about scientist 1 here, is scientist 1 and scientist 2 will always have a difference in opinion. They'll always believe the opposite of what the other believes. So scientist 2's thesis here says that afforestation has many negative impacts. That means that scientist 1's idea will be that it has a positive impact. Let's see. Afforestation is an incredibly valuable and important practice. It has a positive connotation right there. And you'll see this for every single conflicting viewpoint passage that you find. Okay, so now that we know what we're talking about, what the positions of each of the scientists are, we can go ahead and look at the questions. We're going to be attempting this question first, but of course on test day, be sure to look at all of the questions in advance if that helps you, just to get an idea of what you'll be looking for. Now this question is asking about the result of non-native pine trees acidic needles in Scientist 2's passage. So let's see if we find any of these words first. Think of this like a hide-and-seek exercise. They're not telling you what number, but they're giving you keywords. If you find any of these words, chances are good that's going to somehow influence the answer. So I'm going to look for non-native pine trees acidic needles. So just scanning through real quick, I don't see any of that over here. Some pine trees. Non-native pine trees actually is here, but I don't see acidic needles just yet until you hit this sentence right here. Their needles also have acidic qualities. Okay, so acidic needles that lead to the pollution of local rivers and kill nearby plants and microorganisms. All right, so this is again in the context of proving that afforestation has negative impacts on the environment. And it looks like a good reason here, if this is an example, is going to be that these acidic needles lead to the pollution of local rivers, kill nearby plants, and kill microorganisms. So let's see if any of those things show up in the answer choices. So A says a lack of support for endemic species. So it definitely seems like endemic species of plants, animals, and microorganisms are dying. The problem here is going to be the word support. Be very careful. This test will be very literal. Support implies that the result of non-native pine trees acidic needles would be to support endemic species. So somehow the acidic needles result in a support, which would be sort of like an endorsement. You know, people support causes, people support each other, but non-native pine tree acidic needles can't result in supporting something. So that just doesn't make sense. The death of microorganisms. Well, microorganisms were one of the things that were killed by the acidic needle's acidic quality. So this looks really good, but it's not a full answer. Let's see if we find something better. The commercial need, well then again, which of the following is a result? That probably looks like the right answer. Let's see if we find something better anyhow. The commercial need for pesticides. Well, pesticides aren't mentioned here as the result again of non-native pine trees' acidic needles. It could be that they cause a need for pesticides, but then that need wouldn't be commercial unless the fact that we have non-native pine trees' acidic needles there would create a commercial vacuum. That's an in-between step that we don't know anything about. So that can't be correct. The loss of non-shade plants. Potentially. We learn later on, I believe, that non-shade plants are part of the ecosystem. But it's not one of the things that's mentioned literally here as a result of the pine needle's acidic qualities. In fact, I think that pesticides kill those, right? Often use pesticides which get into and damage the local food chains. Also plant trees unnaturally close together. My bad. It's because the trees are planted unnaturally close together that the non-shade plants are choked out. So that has nothing to do with this part of the passage here that was discussing the acidic qualities of the pine needles. So that's why that one is wrong and B is the best answer. This type of question is one that a lot of people will pick. In order to avoid this, make sure that you're looking only around the area of the passage that specifically mentioned these keywords that you found. 9 times out of 10 for this test, all they're going to test is the content immediately around the quoted, or I guess would be quoted portion of the question. Even though they don't give you an outline number and they're not telling you that it's a direct quote, it generally is, and they're looking for information around that area.
So this is a problem that's asking you to summarize what each of the scientists think on an issue that's really at the center of this passage or passages. So it's a question that you really want to leave towards the end when you have a very firm grasp of both of these passages after answering other questions. But for the purposes of our time here, I'm going to pretend that you've never seen these two passages before. So first of all, you want to read the introduction. There's always going to be a definition of a term here. The term we're talking about is afforestation, which is just a fancy way for saying planting new trees in a forest that has grown barren. And it also summarizes very briefly the issue that's going to be discussed in these two paragraphs. So 2 scientists discuss the effects of afforestation on the environment. Now, since this question is asking you to summarize the view of each of these scientists, there are 2 places that you really want to look. And the nice thing too is these passages are rather short. So usually in the introduction and in the conclusion, an author is going to have to preview or summarize their view. So in Scientist 1's passage, you want to look at the conclusion. At this point, the scientist says, the introduction of trees to these areas brings many benefits, including the prevention of soil erosion and the increased absorption of atmospheric carbon. So now that you've read that, think, how can I paraphrase that in my own words? With that paraphrase in your mind, look at the answer choices and see if there's anything that really matches up for what Scientist 1 thinks. So once you do that, you can maybe cross out some answer choices. Clearly, Scientist 1 isn't saying that there would be a decrease in biodiversity. He's talking about benefits, so positives. So let's now move on to what Scientist 2 thinks. Here we want to be looking in the introduction paragraph. Scientist 2 says, in this last sentence right here, these new and foreign trees often damage the ecosystems and decrease biodiversity in the areas they are planted. So do the same thing I told you for scientist one's opinion with scientist two. See if you can paraphrase that in your own words, and then with that in your mind, look at the answer choices and see if anything matches. So now scientist one is saying that there would be benefits like the prevention of soil erosion and the increased absorption of atmospheric carbon, which is another way of saying that scientist one would expect an increase in soil retention. And the wording for the second part, the absorption of atmospheric carbon, is nearly identical. So we don't need to talk much about that. Now let's look at the sentence that we flagged out for scientist two. Scientist two is saying that new and foreign trees can damage the ecosystem and decrease biodiversity. So the conflicting viewpoint here is a negative one. And if we read the belief of scientist two in this final answer choice, we see that scientist two would expect a decrease in stream health and a loss of biodiversity. So streams are part of an ecosystem, so that works with the first part, and again, this second part is nearly identical to the way it's phrased in the answer choice. So that's going to be our correct answer. Let's look quickly at these other two answers. Well, scientist two in this first answer talks about a decrease of biodiversity in the marsh, so that's good, but scientist one never talks about an increase in biodiversity, so for that reason, this can't be the correct answer. And in this answer choice right here, scientist one states something similar, but scientist two definitely doesn't have a positive opinion, and scientist two says that adding trees would actually decrease biodiversity, not increase it, so there wouldn't be an increase in the number of shade plants, there would be a decrease.
The following question is an example of a question that is going to sort of take a different approach. There are many questions that will actually ask about relationships that will show you what would look like a graph in an xy coordinate plane to test your understanding of the passage by asking about the relationship between two things. In this case, we're talking about time and the level of absorption of atmospheric carbon dioxide for the darker lines. So this one and that one, for example, and that one. And the pH balance of local streams. So that's the other line, the lighter one. So for that, we have to look at both scientists 1 and 2. Let's do what we did with that first exercise we looked at and see if we find absolutely any mention of the absorption of atmospheric carbon dioxide or the pH balance of local streams. Starting with scientist 1 here, no mention so far, except for the last sentence here. We got an increased absorption of atmospheric carbon. So as time goes by, we have more absorption of atmospheric carbon. So it looks like answer choice A looks good. Answer choice B doesn't look good. As time goes by, the absorption declines. We have a negative slope here. A negative slope means we're not going to have an increase like it says here, but a decrease. So we can get rid of answer choice B. Answer choice C has absorption of atmospheric carbon dioxide, the darker line going in a positive slope again, so that's also a valid answer choice. Answer choice D also has a negative slope, so we can get rid of that one. Awesome. No mention of the pH balance of local streams so far. But we remember from the first question that we did that we talked about acidity, which has to do with pH. And it was the pine needle's acidity. So if they had acidic quantities that lead to the pollution of local rivers and kill nearby plants and microorganisms. So there's not a balance in the pH of local streams, but organisms are dying off. So it looks like the balance, which would be a positive thing, decreases as we have more trees because of the acidic pine needles. So, answer choice A, as time goes by, the balance seems to increase here. as time goes by, the level of balance. That doesn't make sense. If things are dying, we don't have a higher balance. We have an imbalance going on. So answer choice C has to be our best answer choice. Here, the pH balance of local streams is going down. Trees are dying as the absorption of atmospheric carbon dioxide increases, which is what scientist 1 told us about. So here we had to use both what scientist 1 and scientist 2 tell us about one specific metric that we're keeping track of, and then conceptualize it a little bit differently using a graph. These may show up. If you're a bit confused, try more examples like this on the website. Go through your review tab and check out problems like this in the past and their solution videos. Or, of course, feel free to rewatch this portion of the video until it sort of sinks in a little bit.
The first thing that jumps out to me when I see a question like this is my answer choices. The answer choices here are just scientist 1, scientist 2, both scientists, or neither scientist. So that tells me I'm just going to have to determine which viewpoint this question supports. So I want to keep that in mind before I read the question. Okay, so suppose a study is done of 15 woodland sites that have been created through afforestation by private companies. Okay, so first thing that I notice is this is a new condition. It's a hypothetical that I'm being given. Suppose a study is done through afforestation. Afforestation, I know from the beginning, is a process in which new forests are planted. The study found that each site experienced similar environmental changes: an increase in soil acidity, a decrease in the number of non-shade plants, a decrease in soil erosion, and a decrease of atmospheric carbon dioxide. These findings would best support the viewpoints of, now I have to compare. So here's what I'm going to do. I've got soil acidity, non-shade plants, soil erosion, and atmospheric carbon dioxide. These are the 4 things I'm going to be scanning for. I'm going to kind of quickly scan through and look for any of these terms that I can find. So I'm just kind of scanning through the first one, and I see soil erosion and atmospheric carbon. And now I'm going to scan through scientist 2 and see if I can find anything here. Nothing in the first paragraph. In the second paragraph, I do see acidic listed. It's not necessarily about soil acidity, but I'm still going to underline it. And in the last paragraph, I see non-shade plants. That was definitely one of them. Okay, so let's see what we can find here. So for scientist 1, I'm going to focus on this paragraph. The introduction of trees to these areas brings many benefits, including the prevention of soil erosion and the increased absorption of atmospheric carbon. So prevention of soil erosion, well, we could think of that as being, let's see, that would be like a decrease in soil erosion, right? Because if you're preventing it, less of it is happening. So it's a decrease in soil erosion. And increased absorption of atmospheric carbon. Well, let's see. That would be an increased absorption of atmospheric carbon would correspond with a decrease of that carbon being in the atmosphere. Because if it's being absorbed, there would be less of it. Okay, so it seems like we definitely support scientist 1's viewpoint here. So now we just need to see whether we also support scientist 2's viewpoint, because we can actually rule out this final answer choice. It's not going to be neither, because we know that we support scientist 1. Let's see. So we've got acidic qualities. Their needles also have acidic qualities that lead to the pollution of local rivers and kill nearby plants and microorganisms. Well, if it's seeping into local rivers and killing nearby plants, we can probably assume that the acid from those needles is getting into the soil. I think that's a pretty safe assumption. It might be a little bit of a stretch, but I think it's pretty safe. So we could kind of tentatively say that there's an increase in soil acidity. Now let's look at our last one here. These companies also plant trees unnaturally close together to maximize yield, choking out many of the non-shade plants that would otherwise grow beneath them. So less non-shade plants, so a decrease in non-shade plants. Let's see, was that one of our, yes, a decrease in the number of non-shade plants. So basically we have kind of 2 points that are in favor of scientist one's viewpoint and 2 points of information that are in favor of scientist two's viewpoint. So we can actually say that it is both scientist one and scientist two who have a viewpoint supported by these findings.
This question is asking about the underlying cause for the problems that plague afforested areas according to scientist 2. So we want to forget about what scientist 1 is saying, move straight to the second passage. And a good place to start is the introduction, because the scientist is going to come straight out and tell you what he or she thinks in the introduction typically. Another place to look is the conclusion, but let's look at the introduction here. So the scientist begins by saying, afforestation has many negative impacts. That is the problem that we're facing, afforestation and the negative impacts it causes. So then, as we continue on, we see that private companies are responsible for this afforestation and the negative impacts of afforestation because they are motivated by monetarily valuable things, or they're looking to make a profit. Monetarily just means relating to money. And then we continue on and we say, oh, and here is what is the result of this afforestation, which is caused by companies. Foreign trees often damage the ecosystems and decrease biodiversity. So, our underlying cause of the problem of afforestation, or adding trees to a barren or unforested land, is going to be the unnatural influence of private corporations. And let's now rule out our other answer choices. The acidic effect of pine trees on local soil and rivers is something that's mentioned in the passage, but it's one example of the results, or a form rather, that afforestation can take. It's not a cause of afforestation, it's something that happens in afforestation. So we can rule that out. Damaged food chains due to pesticide use is one form that afforestation can take. Again, not the cause. So we can rule that out. That's going to be found here in the passage, by the way. And the introduction of non-native trees is the definition of afforestation. It is exactly what afforestation is, as described right here, but it's not the cause. So we can rule that out as well.
The last question we'll consider is similar to the others, where you are asked to look for certain information in the passage by considering some keywords. I call those hide and seek questions earlier. But this particular question has a bit of a twist that makes it a bit more complicated. Rather than telling us something specific in the question itself to then look for and match with an answer choice, now we're told that all of the following will have been mentioned except for one. That's a bit complicated, because now you have to look at whether or not all 4 of these things were mentioned in the passage, and that all 4 of them were mentioned as reasons that afforestation is beneficial or positive by scientist 1. It's a lot of things. Now, the fact that it's scientist 1 does make it a bit easier because it's only 2 paragraphs. And it is especially good because we know that whatever is mentioned here, whatever pieces of evidence were given, are going to be proving this thesis here, that afforestation is an incredibly valuable and important practice. So it's positive. So chances are, if it's mentioned underneath a thesis as a piece of evidence, it is in order to say that afforestation is positive. Now, is it positive because it's good for the environment? Let's see. Increase habitat for plants and animals. So I'm going to go ahead and reread very quickly. not seeing anything necessarily, except maybe here, without destroying natural forest environments. It's not increasing or not destroying. And let me just check out really quickly the rest of it. Nothing more. This doesn't seem right. Now, you might have been tempted to not consider this as the exception because scientists too said that afforestation decreased the habitat for plants and animals, and after all, scientists 1 and scientists 2 are supposed to have differing opinions when it comes to this thing. They usually hold opposite points of view. But all that we're saying here is that they're not destroyed, these natural forest environments. Not that we are necessarily increasing the habitat for plants and animals. Though, if we are planting more trees, it probably means that there will be more trees if we're not destroying the originals, but we just can't jump to that conclusion. Decreased erosion into rivers. So one more time, we're just going to go ahead and look at that very quickly. Prevention of soil erosion right here. So that has been mentioned. Okay, so we can go ahead and get rid of this as the answer choice. Preservation of natural forests. Okay, well, we just saw that without destroying natural forest environments, so we can get rid of that one too. And increase absorption of atmospheric carbon dioxide. We saw this on that previous question here. That's the last thing that was mentioned, increase absorption of carbon dioxide. So all three of these are very explicit. See how weird it was for me to go ahead and, maybe arrive at this being the answer without looking at the other answer choices at first? The reasons may be somewhat convincing, somewhat not. You always want to look at the others because for questions like this, whether they be accept or whether they give you something that you want to look for, generally the answer and the text will match almost word for word. You want a very literal match between the answer and something you found on the test for the science tests in general, and especially for the conflicting viewpoint passages. Decreased erosion, we see this word, erosion. Preservation of natural forests, increased absorption of atmospheric carbon dioxide, increased absorption of atmospheric carbon. So we're definitely looking at things that are specifically mentioned, and then things that are more like a jump. It could be true that we're increasing the habitat for plants and animals, but that's not quite said explicitly. You'd have to assume that because we're not getting rid of the original forest and we are planting more forests on barren and unforested land, there may be more space. That would be an assumption. And we don't want assumptions. We want, the answer choice that, in this case, is not a direct match from the text of the question. And in general, you want the answer choice that is almost a direct match from the text is in the answer.
I hope you found this lesson to be helpful. We took a look at the structure of conflicting viewpoint passages and how that structure can be helpful in answering its associated questions.
We saw that each sample question required a different approach, and that each approach was reproducible in a similar passage. Remember to apply these strategies in your assignment this week.
Happy prepping!